Okay, I'm going to say some very dark things in this recording. Sadly, it's somewhat unavoidable. I think that in this year of 2022, it's sort of it's a bit too strange because in the century 1922, I think that's exactly where we are culturally. I think we are reliving through Weimar Germany right now, and I think it's actually crazy just how much these things are lining up exactly. Like literally almost culturally, I think, to the year. So, what do I mean by this? I'm living in Cape Town, South Africa. Someone tried to burn down the parliament buildings. They were essentially almost allowed to or let be done. This person is mentally ill. The facts have come out. And so they are escalating the criminal charges against this person, and they're going to get off of those criminal charges anyway because of insanity, essentially. And so I think that what is actually happening is the politically, it's very easy to imagine that this is a bit of a false flag, or that this whole thing is a conspiracy. It was designed by the radical economic transformation faction, or even the EFF faction, to create the kind of moral chaos and the moral relativism and the moral confusion which allows for the fascistic oversimplification of politics and morality to flourish. Because in some sense, let me just say, obviously, I disagree with the person who tried to burn down Parliament. I actually find it slightly insulting that they're trying to blame Parliament for the state of the country. I mean, it would, in my view, make much more sense to blame the people who vote for the ANC, or blame the people um, who vote for the ANC and the EFF, or the ANC itself. But when you go after Parliament, it must be noted that the most relevant thing that has happened recently in Parliament is that the expropriation without compensation legislation was didn't pass recently. So, if anything, attacking Parliament could be leveraged as a kind of as resonating with the the lack of radical transformation that Parliament is has produced. Um, Either way, I think that essentially it is a victory for the people who are trying to undermine the integrity of the justice system, undermine the integrity of the Constitution. They are trying to create a kind of I think that in some sense, and maybe this is just an accident of history, but at some point, if you want to use Parliament as a representative of the ANC, you could say then perhaps it does deserve to be burnt down because it's filled with so many corrupt people. I don't know why you wouldn't more particularly attack, the things that lead to things that represent the ANC more directly, or that lead to people supporting the ANC more directly, because that systematizing blame, essentially saying that, well, the whole country and the parliament is to blame, when we live in a democracy and people are voting for these corrupt politicians. And do we really have so little democratic literacy that people don't understand that you can't blame other parties that aren't in coalition with government and that aren't the government of the day in the national sphere? So diluting responsibility for the state of the country onto the whole of parliament, I think, is itself a kind of repudiation of democratic literacy, which also lends itself towards the whole systemic oppression narrative of the radical economic racialist movement. The kind of the ethno-fascistic um, identitarian chauvinism, which is the solution to every problem, is that we need more group guilt and retributivism. We need more racialist policy and all of that. So just systematizing the problems of the country and projecting them onto Parliament and not onto the political arena and the actual fault lines within the political arena, is itself, it's fundamentally committed to democratic illiteracy, which again lends itself into the whole radical economic transformation worldview and fascistic worldview. But also now what is happening is that the courts themselves and the courts in some sense represent the liberal order, which obviously has already been betrayed as soon as the constitutional jurisprudence was institutionally corrupted in accepting, racialist policy. Instead of policy that focuses on disadvantage, it focuses on just superficial appearance, and it allows for wholesale corruption and all of these bad things. The courts really shirked their constitutional duty, and they would not use the subclauses of the limitations clause to test the legitimacy or to test the inconsistency of racialist legislation with the Constitution. They wouldn't even do that. They just said there's a governmental prerogative. Democracy gets to decide how racialist it wants to be. Democracy gets to reinterpret the definition of non-racialism. That has been essentially the position of the courts, which is egregious. It's essentially a crime against humanity. We live in a betrayed constitutional order, and the journalists, all they can do is parrot further racialist propaganda, further anti-constitutional hate speech. We live in a very corrupt society, a very morally corrupt society, and it is that moral corruption which facilitates all of the economic corruption. Okay, so that's sort of the status quo. But now what is happening is that these paradoxes and contradictions are, the courts still somewhat represent some rigor and some structure, although COVID, I think, has also taken a blow, has been a blow to the liberal order. We did have some valiant judges saying, no, government can't make these restrictions. There's not good enough reason to stop people from going to the beaches, and then, it's quite disgusting to see how the kind of the authoritarian mood that has been represented in the rest of the world has just been cottoned on by our legal order and our legal tradition and our constitutional framework, has just accommodated this disgusting derogation of the basic rights of a liberal open society, just because you could just say something about safety. And in the same way, this is also how the racial constitutional betrayal, the racialist policy gets away with itself. It says, no, in the name of safety, we get to do this, so we don't have to do a very careful constitutional check for inconsistency, because it's being done for the downtrodden, it's being done for the underdog, and therefore government can do whatever it wants, even if it's stealing whatever it wants to steal along the way. It's using the poor as a human shield, it's using the poor as an excuse to be more and more radical, and other people have to count the cost, and they keep on making a worse situation even more devastating. Because they all never have to count the cost. They can in fact use it as political fuel to be even more radical and influence even more control over the economy, as they make the situation far worse and devastating. So it's a self-fueling fascistic, sort of acceleration, where it's not capable of diagnosing that it is the problem, that it is causing its own problem, that it's a self-fueled problem, because we don't have the accountability that should have been imposed by the courts. The courts should have said, no, you can't make law like this, it's unconstitutional. And therefore, then the government would have run out of policy to go to excuse its poor performance, saying, no, well, the problem is that we need to be more radical The courts wouldn't actually be a bulwark. In fact, the courts were afraid, I guess, to say, well, we don't want to be made the scapegoat, and we don't want to be blamed for the failures of government, because if we stopped government from being more radical, then they would say that the courts are stopping them. But in some sense, we know that that was never the actual story. The story is that the ruling party has been choosing judicial nominations. They have been implanting judges that are put there to subvert the constitution and facilitate wholesale corruption, essentially, to manufacture the constitutional jurisprudence that allows and permits the status quo to continue its sort of slow motion calamity, the slow motion train wreck that is South Africa. And so, in the context of the slow motion train wreck, obviously we have to be gaslighted so that it can continue. And how you do that is that you have to sort of start invalidating accountability itself, the concept of accountability, the concept of coherence and responsibility. And so you have to kind of say that, well, we need a strong authoritarian answer to all questions, and the courts are just getting in the way, and the courts are even morally confused themselves. So, when someone tries to burn down parliament, we call them guilty of treason and of terrorism before we say that they're not guilty of any of these things, they're just crazy. So, we'll throw the book at them, and then we'll go over backwards. There should really just be actually a crime which is called sort of a mock crime, where essentially you call it a motivated investigation for endangerment, where essentially part of that crime is that you simulate a trial in the thing that they would have been charged with to see if they would have been found guilty but for the lack of capacity, and then you sentence them essentially to commitment in a health institution for observation, essentially, and for or not just observation, but for essentially containment, because they are a danger to themselves and others. And you have psychological expert witnesses and things like that, but and you have that they actually did these actions, and that they are prone to perhaps they are going to be endemically prone to continuing to do such similar things without very strict supervision, essentially, which essentially can only be done via commitment to an institution. So it's basically a form of prison, but perhaps a more compassionate one, in which treatment is part of the sentence. So sort of, I think that the moral coherence of the judiciary itself is what is being assailed, is what is being potentially what is constructively being assaulted through what is potentially a kind of, maybe this is a conspiracy theory, a kind of false flag. But too many things perhaps are lining up. That can you really just say that the government is so incompetent that this isn't actually helpful? I mean, yes, it might seem that this is both embarrassing and strange, but as much as it's strange, it's a helpful distraction. That lends itself legs and ammunition to the RET side of the aisle. This is exactly how you demoralize a liberal order. This is exactly how you destabilize an open liberal society, which has already taken many knocks and destabilization. The racialist rhetoric, the the toxic nature and the Zuma thing with the court system, the failure to prosecute corruption. Um, it's almost as if that this whole event was designed just to just to help undermine the credibility of the judiciary itself. Because prosecuting someone who is essentially, you could say, vaguely is symbolically airing anger on behalf of the ineffectual state of South African politics. I mean, I do think it's completely misplaced. If you want to blame the state of South African politics, you have to blame people who vote for the ANC and the EFF, and and maybe symbols of those political parties are the places where you should nail your protest. If you have issues, perhaps you should nail your your manifesto and your protest to the doors of some representative office of the ANC and the EFF. Although obviously complaining to the EFF is sort of is a bit of playing into their drama, because they want people to go after them to some degree, because then they can justify their sort of victimization persecution complex, which is part of their whole worldview, is part of the whole fascistic worldview, so that they can continually indict systemic structures for not already giving them all the power that they deserve to fix the problem, because they would, and they're not just sort of opportunistic and corrupt operators that will only facilitate things like expropriation without compensation, when they very clearly are going to get a piece of the pie. They're not going to give that tool to the ANC for nothing. And the ANC perhaps isn't ready to go overtly all the way into a kind of authoritarian, centralized, top-down sort of gulag of a country, or perhaps Auschwitz would be a better analogy, because that seems to be more likely. You would have to. I think that we're more likely, when things collapse, it's more likely to trigger something like a genocide. Because without that, I don't know if it'll be justifiable in terms of their own political narrative. But I mean, I guess perhaps you don't need to do that if you can just sort of legalistically take everything and just leave people with nothing, and then you just kind of march them, like the Armenian genocide. So it would probably take the form of a kind of Armenian genocide that happened in Turkey. So yeah, this is where we are. I mean, I also think it's useful to help to try to preempt some of this stuff, to get ahead of the racial politics, and to remind people of the toxic flow of racialized politics. The president himself in State of the Nation addresses would give these disgusting statistics, which I would argue are very dishonest statistics, very cherry picked to inform his narrative, that completely overlook, the fact that how many people are missing in South Africa because they've just left the country, because there's that's how good white privilege is that sort of, if you're my age, it's unlikely that if you're my age and you're white, you shouldn't even be in the country, essentially, because there's absolutely no future for you, essentially. or it's such an uphill battle. Uh, and almost anyone who's a professional should also just leave the country. It doesn't matter what color of the skin that they may have, because it's just when you've got such a controlled economy where the labor market is so intensely toxic with this political racial consciousness, you just you there's no meritocracy. It's all just corruption. It's all just this the if you can't doubt people's credentials, then you're a bit insane. And if you um, it creates all these disgusting paradoxes. You can't trust people when trust in a market, in a society, has been displaced by this disgusting self-pitying um, racial chauvinism, which is now just it's proliferated out of necessity, because that is how the law works. The law works by racial consciousness, by group guilt, by group association. It's utterly disgusting. But when you switch on the radio and you listen to a black composer talk about his own, because obviously in terms of some grant that he was given, or some sponsorship that he was given from some company, it all had to do with this diversity and inclusion and equality, anti-racist rhetoric, which means that every time that you say anything, you have to complain about the systemic oppression caused by white privilege and white supremacy. So it's and you have to sing that song, you have to repeat that narrative, because otherwise you don't get the dividends. Otherwise you don't get the special dispensation. So it's created a whole false market of ideology, which is paid for, and what you get people that aren't as good. Meritocracy is displaced by this kind of ostentatious ideological racial consciousness. And you can see that these pretenders are everywhere. They do not deserve their post, and they will never deserve their post, because they can't develop the skills, because they're not being treated in the same way that they should be treated. So they're being treated artificially, and so parity and equality is just not on the table, because the table has been overturned. The table has been made unstable. It's been made warped by this racialist consciousness and obsession with racial consciousness, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy now. And it will have to vent its frustration at its own ineffectualness. It will have to find a scapegoat, as all fascistic ideologies do. It'll have to double down on itself, which it is in the process of doing. And no one is willing to actually hold the line. No one is willing to stand up and be used as a cultural focal point and a fulcrum to which to push back against this stuff. And I mean, this is why I think Helen Ziller is more popular than the DA itself. And the DA really needs to work out how to integrate a stronger political line of argument, which is more what Helen Ziller represents, which is not fully distributed within the DA in terms of its ideological positioning. And that's dangerous, because what does the DA stand for? I always think, are we really just, is Helen Ziller really just a kind of poster child for the DA? And then, feels, I'm afraid, because she's old. What happens when she stops being part of the DA? Does the DA completely dissolve back into its into what it was doing before, which is playing with fire, because it essentially it relinquishes integrity. for trying to for political expediency, and the idea is that, well, there's an appetite for this kind of racialist ideology, so let's just feed into it. And if you're not willing to give the full diagnosis of what's going wrong with South Africa, then it doesn't really matter, even if you supposedly aren't on the right side, or you are on the right side. If you're not willing to make the full argument, then you're not going to change anyone's mind. You're not going to convince anyone, and then we're just going to slow boil in the racialist cauldron of fascistic worldview, which is being propagated by everyone in the ANC, because it's the only thing holding them together. It's the only ideological thread that keeps the show on the road. So uh, we've got a poisonous racialist ideology that pays dividends to its adherents, to its ideological acolytes, and we have no one that is proffering the diagnosis of this. Instead, we just get people like Professor Lushaba at UCT, who's essentially a fascist, who should go to jail for constitutional damages, who should at the very least be fired and take no salary from a public purse for propagating anti-constitutional propaganda. But you just get free reign if you are a fascist. And if you're a black fascist in South Africa, the world is your oyster. You can take anyone to task. You can take anyone ransom. You can go do whatever you want. You can go establish your own Gestapo, and you can go start burning things and rioting. You can do whatever you want. You can victimize whoever you want. You can go rent seek. It's ideological rent seeking, and it'll never end until someone actually diagnoses it, and someone actually leverages a counter polemic against these people. But and the only person who symbolizes that within the whole political arena is probably Helen Ziller, and that is not even properly firmly distributed within the DA. And if the DA does not represent this, then they're not being serious, because they are really committing us to being slowly boiled in this filth, in this racialist filth. But it's problematic as well, because the filth has gotten into the judiciary. We have a judiciary that has betrayed the Constitution, and if we don't have a political voice to say this, then we're fucked, essentially. And so I think we are just as fucked as Weimar Germany was fucked in the 1922s, and that's where we are now. And so when does Kristallnacht happen? Is it 1925? 3 years from now? I think we're on track. So, they're winning, we're losing. The liberal order is in decline, and I still don't see anyone speaking up for it. Not. We need a shadow public protector who will actually speak on behalf of these sorts of things. No one is making those sorts of claims. We live in a thoroughly fascistically entrenched culture. And I'll still say that, everything that happens to South Africa, the electorate, us collectively, South Africans deserve what's happening to it, because it's moral corruption. It's moral corruption. The state corruption is a symptom of moral corruption. And that's why I think it's important that this moral polemic be made, so that people are put on what's the word? They're put on, so that they have been warned, and that they are put on, the onus is on them. Sorry, what's the idiom? I can't remember the idiom. That they're put on. What's the name of so that they are put on. So they are made consciously responsible is the point, essentially. So that they can't say they didn't know that they were selling us collectively to hell in a handbasket. So they can't just say, oh, well, the propaganda sounded so sweet and everyone agreed, and all the journalists cooed along with the chorus of the toxic racialist consciousness. They can't use the excuse of, oh well, everybody else seemed to think that it was a reasonable idea. You know, as we blindly sleepwalked ourselves like zombies into fascism because everyone thought that the conspiracy theory of white supremacy was somehow true, and did not see the parallel between that and the Nazi Jewish conspiracy. Were so stupid that they couldn't see the obvious parallel between obviously false consciousness and essentially an insidious form of I mean, because this stuff is really, it's not only corrupt on a social level, it's corrupt on an individual level. Everyone who believes in identity politics, these are evil people. These are miscreants. These are people who, if there is a hell, that's where they deserve to end up. There's a circle of hell waiting to receive these people, and that circle of hell also has the Nazis, from the past put there. And now we've got a new generation of Nazis. That's all that's happened. It's quite simple. But we don't have people condemning these people, and it's really a shame, and pointing out the moral flaw, because we don't even have honest people on the radio. We've got people that have pre-recorded radio shows, and they won't let you talk about this, because if you talk about this, then they'll immediately put the phone down on you, and they'll say, you're politically incorrect. What you're saying is very offensive. Do I care that I'm offending people that are moral scum? No, I don't. And in fact, that's what they say about me. That's what they say about the people that they're ideologically opposed to. They call them essentially, the justification. I mean, I've heard it said on the radio. I'm not. This is what was literally said on the radio. I'm not calling for a genocide, but all I'm saying is that if there was a genocide in this country, we couldn't say that it was unjustified. So that's how they talk about their project. That's how they talk about their project. And I can't even call in and morally condemn these people because of being politically incorrect and offending these fascists. So radio hosts like that can say disgusting things, essentially dog whistling for genocide. But I can't call in and have a moral complaint against them because it's going to offend their feelings. I'm going to offend the feelings of these fascists, and it's funny because their whole worldview depends on them holding the moral high ground and not even being able to be contested. If anyone even contests their worldview, then they have to go and try to assassinate them or go to try to burn them down or destroy something. There must be a tangible punishment which is affected for challenging their worldview. And because and we have the perfect ingredients to challenge them. We can say, no, you're destroying the Constitution. This is anti-constitutional propaganda. And just because you've corrupted the law already in line with your racialist worldview and ideology doesn't mean that it's not unconstitutional, and that you haven't just intoxicated the courts themselves. And because you've done this, now we don't have political accountability anymore, and we don't have democratic literacy anymore because you've undermined those things, and we need to bring them back. Otherwise, things will continue to get worse, and it's all your fault. And because this is moral corruption. And because no one is willing to voice that counter-argument, we boil. And perhaps we deserve to boil if no one has the courage, if no leader in this country has the courage to leverage and levy that polemic. The only thing is, Helen Ziller is the only voice that I can see on that wavelength. And her whole party does not overtly adopt her line. It does and it doesn't. But I think you need the DA needs a shadow public protector that are making these kinds of points. I don't see a way around it.